Hey all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie. This is where I talk about knitting, my tips, my tricks, my opinions, and my preferences. I heart short rows. I always have, I don't know why, I just really enjoy them. A couple of months ago, I did a video on how all short row techniques have the same structure. And I did get a couple of questions afterwards about one particular technique, and that was the German double stitch short row. I love German double stitch. This is one of my favorite short row techniques, and I'm so excited to share with you more about it. We'll look at how it's done on the knit side, how you use it for a purl side. I will show you what to do if you drop a stitch and your German double stitch comes undone. I swear, it's so easy, you won't believe it. And we will discuss how to substitute German double stitch for other short row techniques. So if you want to find out all about it, make sure you hit subscribe and the notification bell, give my video a thumbs up, and let's knit some short rows. Quick thing before we get started, down in the description box is a list of materials that I used in today's video. With this list of materials, you will find affiliate links. If you click on an affiliate link, it will take you to a website where you can shop. And if you make a purchase, I might receive a small commission. The goal of this channel is to spread the joy of knitting and crafting in general, and affiliate links help support my effort. So if you utilize one of my affiliate links, thank you very much. I so appreciate it, and I want you to know that I will never recommend a product or a service that I can't recommend to my very best friend, who is my sister. Like I said in the introduction, I did a whole video on how short rows work generally and what the structure of all short row techniques are. And so I'm not going to go through all of that in this video, but if you want to understand more about short rows, why there are different short row techniques, why you do a wrap and turn, it's to close up holes. I have that video, it's down in the description box, and if you don't know about these things yet, I highly recommend checking out that video. But today, really just want to focus on the love and joy of the German double stitch. The German double stitch, I think, is one of the nicest short row techniques out there. When I learned the German double stitch, I was like, oh my gosh, the heavens opened up, and it was like, oh, this is so much easier. It's easy to do, it's super tidy, and I think it's probably easier if I show you what I mean by tidy. So, just get this. Yeah, this is my favorite dishcloth pattern, and I use German double stitch when I knit this. And I want you to just look. Right here, you can see these swirly lines. These are the spots where I stopped, I turned my work, and I knitted back. So this is where, if I didn't use some kind of short row technique, I would have holes in my work. I'm going to turn this over. You can see this ridge spot right here. These are the German double stitches after I worked them. And you can see, I'll just see if I can bring this up a little closer. There we go. You can see how tidy these are. So there is a noticeable technique going here, but it's not super loose. Some other, I wish I had an example, but I don't really use them all that often. I might. A knitted project that I've had forever that I never have finished. All I need to do is sew it. But it's actually the first project that I ever did a short row with. And it used the wrap and turn method. And you can see right here and here are the wrap and turns. And this right here, that loop of yarn there, that's the wrap. Now compare that to this, which is the German double stitch. And you can just see they're just so tidy. The tension on the wraps pretty much matches the tension of the stitches around it. So yes, I love the German double stitch. I think there's so many great things about it. And I think the best way to see all the advantages of it is to see it in action. So let's jump in and I will show you how you work the German double stitch short row. Let's take a look on how we do the German double stitch. I have my swatch right here, and I'm going to just knit to 2 stitches before the end of the row. So here I am, I'm 2 stitches before the end, and here is where I want to do my short row. Now, real quickly, if you haven't heard already, the anatomy of short rows generally, the way that I think about them. Here are my short row stitches. These are the stitches that I'm going to turn and work back to complete my short row. These 2 stitches are what I think of as my left behind stitches. They're the stitches that are going to hang out on my needle and not be worked until I'm ready to work all the wraps of my short row. And this stitch right here is a really special stitch because this is what I think of as the anchor stitch. If I were to do a wrap and turn, this is the stitch that I would wrap my yarn around, okay? The anchor stitch is always the first stitch of the left behind stitches. And this is, I call this the anchor stitch because this is the stitch where the wrap that I'm going to make gets worked into to close up any gap that would form from turning the work before completing the row. Again, if you want more explanation on all of this, check out my Knitting Secrets Revealed short row structures. Anyway, as I said, this is my anchor stitch. So this is the stitch that I would normally do my wrap and turn into. For the German double stitch, however, I'm not going to wrap my yarn around this stitch. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work a knit stitch like this, turn my needles, then I'm going to pass this stitch that I just worked back to my right hand needle, and here's where the German double stitch comes in. I'm going to take the yarn and I'm going to bring it over the top of the needle and capsize this stitch. Normally when you capsize your stitch, you've made a mistake, and that is a very common mistake for beginning knitters. Did it myself. It's how a lot of times we end up with extra stitches when we first learn how to knit. But in this case, we're going to use it to our advantage. So that's how I do it. I bring the yarn over the top of the needle. This has capsized the stitch. These are the 2 legs of the stitch that I just worked into. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the yarn back around to the front of the needle so that I can purl back. And I'm going to purl back to 2 stitches before the end. So I'm going to do my purl back. All right, here I am. And I have now completed my second short row because I am now, here I am at 2 stitches before the end. So right here, notice something. These are the 2 left behind stitches of my previous short row. These are my short row stitches. And this is my next set of left behind stitches. So this is my anchor stitch right here. And trust me, the reason I'm emphasizing this will matter when it comes time to understand how to substitute German double stitch for other short row techniques. But this is my anchor stitch. So again, if I were doing wrap and turn, this is the stitch that I would wrap my working yarn around. But we're not, we're doing German double stitch. So I'm going to purl into the stitch, thusly. Again, this time I'm going to turn my needles first. Okay, because I need to capsize this stitch. So I'm going to bring the yarn to the front of the work. I'm going to slip the stitch back to my right needle. Then I'm going to take my yarn that's to the front of the work, take it, I'm going to bring it over the top of the needle, and now I've capsized the stitch. So these 2 bits of yarn here, these are the 2 legs of the stitch that I purled into. Okay, and the yarn is to the back of the work. Now I'm ready to knit back and do my next short row. So you can see that doing the German double stitch is actually very easy. All you're doing is you are capsizing the stitch that you just worked into. You are pulling that stitch that you just worked into up over the needle. And you're doing that by taking your working yarn and just pulling it from the front of the work to the back of the work by pulling it over the top of the needle. So I'm going to show you again how this works, but this time I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what is happening with the German double stitch as you're doing this. If I were working a pattern, right, and it said to work to 2 stitches before the wrap, that's a very common way of identifying when to do your next short row. You might be going, well, where's my wrap? Well, substitute the word wrap for German double stitch. This is my German double stitch. That's where my wrap is. So I'm going to work to 2 stitches before my wrap. So that's this right here. So I'll knit to this stitch,
which is 2 stitches before the German double stitch.
So whenever you see wrap in a pattern, substitute German double stitch, and you will be able to understand where you're at, because the German double stitch is holding your wrap for you right now. Before I work back though, I just want to quickly identify the parts of my short row, because at this point I've done 2 short rows. How do I know that? Because I have 2 German double stitch. I have my first German double stitch here. All right, so that represents short row 1. And then I have my second German double stitch here. So this represents my second short row. One of the things I really love about German double stitch is that identifying where the German double stitch is really easy because it's very distinctive. It doesn't look right. It's also really nice when it comes time later to work your wraps because you know exactly where your wraps are. You don't accidentally knit past them, which has happened to me with wrap and turn. So this is my first set of left behind stitches over here. This is my second set of left behind stitches on this side. And in the middle, these are my short row stitches. So let's knit back and I'll show you again how to do the German double stitch. Okay, so there's my German double stitch. I need to do one more. All right, so here I am. I'm all set up. All right, so here's my German double stitch. Here's the 2 stitches before it. So I'm finished my 3rd short row. And that means I need to do my next technique, my next short row technique. These 2 stitches are now joining the left behind stitches, and this is my next anchor stitch right here. So I just do a knit stitch, turn my needles, slip the stitch back to my right needle. I take the yarn, the working yarn, I bring it over the top of my right needle and capsize the stitch. And there's my second German double stitch right here. Okay. So here's something I want you to maybe try to think about in terms of German double stitch and wraps and what is going on with your knitting. If this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it, leave it behind. But this helps me understand what is going on with German double stitch. So I worked a knit stitch, basically, right, to make this stitch. Then I bring my yarn over and capsize it. These 2 legs are the stitch that I knitted into, that I brought over the top of my needle. And down here, that piece of yarn underneath my needle now that's the working yarn. I don't think of this yarn as a stitch. I think of this yarn right here, this little single strand, as the wrap. All right, because this is the loop of yarn that gets left behind to tie the anchor stitch to the short rows to close up any gaps. This isn't a real stitch, it's a wrap. The reason that helps me out, understanding that structurally, is because then it makes sense with if there's a mistake later, if I want to make a substitution later, I understand what this strand of yarn is. This will make more sense. Just for right now, understand this is not a stitch, it's a wrap. So now that you understand how to create the German double stitch, let's look at how you work your wraps once you've completed all of your short rows. So once you're done with short rows, right, you have all these left behind stitches, and all these left behind stitches are holding wraps. So let's look just real quick. All right, so right here, this is my last German double stitch I just did. Everything on this side, these are all left behind stitches. This is the last German double stitch I did on the left side. These are all left behind stitches. These are my short row stitches right here. We are now going to create one single row once again. We're going to bring all the left behind stitches back into the work, and we're going to do it in a way that makes sure that we don't create any holes. So I'm just going to knit across my short row stitches until I get to a German double stitch. Okay. All right, here's my first German double stitch. What do? These two strands of yarn, there's this one and this one, I'm going to just knit into them as if this were a stitch. It looks almost like doing a knit two together. And boom, it's done. That's all it is. This is the beauty of the German double stitch, is when it's time to work your wraps, you're just knitting into these two strands of yarn. The thing you want to make sure, notice that right there, that strand of yarn right there is your wrap. Right there, that's my next German double stitch. So I just knit into those two legs like that, and boom. And look, these are all worked. I'm gonna turn my work right here. There's the wrap of yarn, and then there's the purl bump of the stitch below, right there. I'm gonna turn my work, and I'm gonna purl back so I can then complete the stitches on this side. All right, so I'm back here. This is the first German double stitch on the right side of my knitting, or in this case, the left on the purl side. And again, there's these two strands of yarn. It looks a little funky. Just purl into those two strands of yarn. And that's a regular stitch. Here's my next German double stitch. I just make sure that my needle comes through those two strands of yarn and purl. Regular stitch. Purl into the German double stitch. And my last purl stitch. And there it is. That is my completed set of short rows. All right, and you can see the little arc that got formed here. This is the beauty of short rows, is that it creates this arc right here. Knitting, as in life, mistakes happen. Errors occur, stuff happens. Remember, my pattern was to work to 2 stitches before my previous wrap, then turn my work and go back. Well, look, here I am, and I was about to work off my short rows, but look here. I have 2 German double stitches next together, which means that I have not done my short rows correctly on this side. So I need to go back. Now there's 2 ways to do this, obviously. I can tink back, or I can frog back. Now normally, something like this, it's a couple rows behind, I would frog, but to be honest, when it comes to short rows, especially German double stitch short rows, things can get undone and hairy really quickly. So I find that caution is the better part of valor, and it's best with German double stitch to tink back. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and tink back my work. All right, I've tinked there. Now, this is my German double stitch, no big deal. I'm going to just pull that off, and this stitch is there. Look how easily that stitch came off of this German double stitch. Now I can turn my needles and tink back the other way. So I'm going to keep tinking back like this until I get to where my mistake is. Tinking back, tinking back. So tinked that, that's come undone. Here, all right, so I'm gonna have to go back there and, oh, wait, oh, shoot. Oh no, I just made it worse. So I have dropped my German double stitch off the needle and it has come undone. Now this can look really confusing and weird because you got this stitch here. Well, that's a normal stitch, that's fine. So I'm gonna just put that back up on the needle. But what is this? What is this loop of yarn right here? Okay. This loop of yarn right here is your wrap. If your German double stitch comes undone, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see your anchor stitch and you're going to see this loop of yarn coming off of this stitch here in your short row. If you undo a German double stitch by accident, it's not a big deal. You don't have to try to recreate it. All you got to do is preserve the wrap and get it back up on your needle, just like you would a stitch. Because remember, all short row techniques work the same, which is you leave a wrap of yarn behind that will get worked with your anchor stitch, which is the first stitch in your left behind stitches. And then when you're ready to work your left behind stitches with the rest of the row, the wrap and the anchor stitch get worked together to close your gaps. If this is a wrap, then I can just bring it up on the needle thusly. And now this is what it looks like. So this is my anchor stitch, this is my wrap. When it's time to work these left behind stitches, I just work my wrap with my left behind stitch. It's really not that complicated once you understand what it is that you're looking at. So now I've got this sorted out. I'm going to just put this up here. Let's see. So this is my wrap. I'm supposed to work to 2 stitches before my wrap. So if this is my wrap, this is 1 stitch. This is 2 stitches. So actually this, I'm going to undo this here because this is my next German double stitch. So here's my wrap, here's the 2 stitches before the wrap, this is my new anchor stitch. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do my German double stitch. Thusly. Bring this to the back and work across. So just to show you what it looks like when you're ready to work your left behind stitches, I'm going to go ahead and finish this now. So German double stitch, just work that like a German double stitch. And here's where you have to be careful, okay? That was a German double stitch. It almost looks like this here is another German double stitch, but it's not. Remember, we worked 2 stitches before each wrap. The reason you know this is not a German double stitch is look, here's your wrap. Here is a big gap here, and here are 2 stitches. The whole point of short row techniques, no matter what they are, is to close this gap. So this may look like a German double stitch, but it's not. This is your normal stitch. This is the wrap. Here's your anchor stitch, and you work those 2 together to close the gap. If you have a situation like that where you have dropped a German double stitch, it's come undone, so you just put the wrap back up on the needle, make sure that you look and go, wait a minute, is there a gap on the other side of that? What looks like a German double stitch? There's a gap there. You know that what you're looking at is not a German double stitch. It is a normal stitch with the wrap next to it. Common question comes up on the internet.
Can I substitute German double stitch for wrap and turn?
Of course you can. All it takes is understanding where is your anchor stitch. Once you know where your anchor stitch is, and you've identified what the anchor stitch is, you can then figure out how to substitute one short row technique for another because structurally, they're all the same. I've got my swatch here. All right, and we're back at the beginning. My pattern says to work to 3 stitches before the end and then do a wrap and turn.
But I want to do a German double stitch.
Well, let's think about this again. As always, what is going on with short rows? You have your short row stitches, you have your left behind stitches, right? And the first stitch of your left behind stitches, that's your anchor stitch. That anchor stitch gets worked with a wrap to close the gap. So if I want to substitute any short row technique for another one, what I really need to do is identify where is my anchor stitch. So here's my left behind stitches, because these are the 3 stitches to the end. That's my anchor stitch. So the stitch with which I would do my wrap and turn, I would wrap the yarn around the stitch, is the stitch that I will do the German double stitch with. Okay? So I do my German double stitch, I wrap, turn, and I capsize the stitch over. This is another reason why I think it's good to think of the German double stitch not as a stitch, right? That this stitch is a wrap. And to think of it as this is my anchor stitch with the wrap attached to it. Because I think thinking of it this way helps troubleshoot problems, but I think it also helps understand how to do a substitution. Even a substitution the other way. Maybe a pattern calls for German double stitch and you want to do a wrap and turn instead. Could happen. Well, how do you identify that? Well, the stitch that created the German double stitch, that's the stitch, that's my anchor stitch. What do I do with my anchor stitch in a wrap and turn? I wrap the working yarn around it. I hope that this has helped answer questions about German double stitch and give you a better understanding of how to do the German double stitch, how it works, and how to troubleshoot and substitute with it. I love the German double stitch. I love it because of its simplicity. I love it because of how tidy it is. And I do love it because of how easy it is to identify where the German double stitch is before you've worked those wrapped stitches. Now, when might you want to use German double stitch? I feel like it's more of a question when you may not want to use German double stitch, more so than even when you might want to use it. I would say that German double stitch is probably the short row technique that I turn to 90% of the time. There are some situations where I may not choose to use it, namely lace. With lace knitting, I think there's so much going on with decreases and yarn overs. The German double stitch may get a little lost in all of that business, and I would probably turn to the Japanese short row in that situation. But outside of that, I think most situations, I would just use the German double stitch. Yeah, I would. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. Liking videos, sharing videos, hitting subscribe, and the notification bell is a great way to support my channel. It lets YouTube know that this is a space worth checking out, which makes it easier for other knitters and crafters to find. And hitting the notification bell alerts you whenever I upload a new video or I start a live stream. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy knitting. Bye! By the way, before you go, if you're like, Carrie, I'm having such a great time, up on the screen, there's going to be a couple of video suggestions that pop up. You can click on one of them and enjoy another video. Or if you got the rest of your day, don't worry, I'm still here and you can subscribe to my channel and I will come up in your feed. You have one more chance to subscribe to my channel by clicking on the picture down in the corner. Is it this one or is it this one? I always forget. But if you click on the picture, you can subscribe to my channel. Okay, all the plugs are done and I had to have lunch and go hug my daughter. Anyway, bye.